Mark chapter 13 is, we're kind of coming to the conclusion of this COVID pandemic. Well, hopefully we're coming to the conclusion of the COVID pandemic because, as COVID really started, there were a lot of people who were convinced that COVID was a sign of the end of the world. And that, they can read about COVID in Revelation or read about COVID and Jesus' Olivet Discourse. But, as we have noticed for the last several Wednesday nights that we've been studying Mark chapter 13, I don't believe that that's the subject under discussion. You remember how we noted beginning in chapter 11 that the Jewish leaders have been opposing Jesus. The Jewish leaders in Jerusalem have actively been opposing Jesus. And so Mark chapter 13 is kind of the culmination of that. The Jewish leaders are going to demand that Pilate crucify Jesus, but that's not the end of the story. Jesus is going to be resurrected. And Mark chapter 13 is a prophecy of Jesus' judgment that he's going to bring upon the unbelievers in Jerusalem. And as I said for several weeks, I believe that most of what was written in Mark chapter 13, as well as in Matthew chapter 24 and in Luke chapter 21, most of that was fulfilled whenever the Roman armies were able to breach the walls of Jerusalem in AD 70 and destroy the city. And so we shouldn't be reading Mark chapter 13 with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other hand, just trying to find some correspondence between what Jesus foretold and what's happening now. But rather we ought to be reading Mark chapter 13 with the Bible in one hand and a history book, or Josephus' account of the Jewish-Roman War in the other hand, to see the fulfillment of what Jesus wrote. Jesus is no false prophet. What Jesus prophesied here, it certainly was fulfilled. And then, of course, at the end of Mark chapter 13, we'll see, and Matthew chapter 24, and in Luke's account, it's primarily Luke chapter 17. There's a bit at the end of Luke 21. He does also speak concerning the second coming. But as our class time ended last week, as I recall, we were looking in verse 14 and kind of extended our comments a little bit in verse 14, where Jesus says to his disciples, "When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." And so we pointed out how what Mark and Matthew cryptically refer to as the abomination that causes desolation, Luke just explicitly declares what it was. Look again at Luke chapter 21, verse 20, and then we'll move forward. Luke 21, look at verse 20. Luke records Jesus as saying, "When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that desolation is near." The abomination of desolation. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, there's the abomination. Know that its desolation is near. Know that it's about to be desolate. It's about to be rid of all of its inhabitants. Rome, the Jews that are in the city, and the Jews that are not killed in the city are going to be carried away into captivity. And so, of course, as we pointed out, that happened first with the armies under the command of Cestius Gallus in 66, as the Jewish-Roman War began to break out, and then he pulled back his troops. We'll comment on that in a few moments as we get down farther into Mark chapter 13, and then that happened finally as Titus, who would become emperor, as he led his armies to surround Jerusalem for 7 months in AD 70, until finally in the summer of AD 70, Jerusalem fell. But at any rate, you remember the disciples, as Jesus foretold that not one stone would be left on another in Jerusalem, all would be thrown down. The disciples asked 2 questions. when this will happen, sign when it's about to happen. Well, this is Jesus' answer concerning the sign. This is the sign. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, that's the sign that what I'm telling you is about to take place. So Jesus says to his disciples, here's what you need to do when you see this sign. Mark 13, verse 14. He says, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. And by the way, that's just a clue. You know, the fact that it says those who are in Judea, let them flee to the mountains. That's a clue that what Jesus is talking about is not some, event that has, worldwide significance near the end of time. This is an event that has significance for those Jews who lived in Judea, who rejected Jesus Christ. And this is a warning to the disciples who have faith in Jesus Christ as to how to avoid this calamity that's going to come upon the unbelieving Jews. So when you see this happen, what you need to do is flee to the mountains. The mountains where you could find hiding places. Oftentimes the Jews in, times of war, obviously armies, if an invading army attacks a country, where do they go to attack? They go to population centers. So if you want to be saved from this attacking army, you want to flee the population centers. You want to flee to the mountains. And remember, that's what, for instance, the Jews did when the Midianites invaded in the time of Gideon. You remember how the people fled. They fled from the population centers. They fled to the mountains. They fled to the unpopulated areas. And I think I brought this up earlier. Eusebius, who's known as kind of the first church historian, he commented in the 4th century that the Christian Jews were not killed in the Jewish-Roman War. They fled when they saw these signs fulfilled. And by the way, Eusebius makes clear reference to these prophecies of the destruction of Jerusalem in Matthew 24 and Mark 13 and Luke chapter 21, and he views them as being fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem. And he makes the point that the Christians fled across the Jordan River to the area east of the Jordan River, to the town of Pella, where they were kept safe. And at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, we're told that John, the Apostle John, who had kind of stayed in that area, John went and he lived out his closing days in the city of Ephesus, in Asia Minor, what we know of as modern-day Turkey. Verse 15, let no one on the housetop go down to enter the house or take anything out. Now, we don't spend a lot of time on our housetops, especially not this week with 105-degree temperatures. We don't have housetops that are conducive for, spending time on them. But, of course, in Jerusalem and in that part of the world at this point in time, you had flat roofs that were used for a lot of things. You remember David was walking on his roof in the evening. You'd go up on your roof to cool off, so on and so forth. Well, anyone on their housetop, Jesus says, don't go down. You need to run across the housetops and get out of town as soon as possible. That's the idea. Get out of town. Jesus says, verse 16, let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. Now, as prosperous as what we are, losing a coat isn't such a big thing. They weren't, relatively speaking, as wealthy as we are. And your cloak, your outer garment, that was a valuable thing. For some poor people, that might be the only thing they had. And, there are times like in Exodus 22 where Jesus says that if a widow borrows from you and, or a poor person borrows from you and you take their cloak, as surety that they'll pay their debt, you be sure to give them their cloak back before nightfall, or else they don't have anything else to sleep in and they curse you before God. So, a cloak was a valuable thing at that particular point in time. Remember how the Roman soldiers would cast lots in order to get Jesus' cloak, because it was, valuable enough. They didn't want to, cut it into pieces like they'd done his other garments.
Well, this cloak, this valuable piece, and if you're fleeing for your life, you want to have your cloak with you. If you're fleeing into the mountains, you want to have your cloak in order to sleep in it. But Jesus said, listen, it's imperative. Your life's at risk. If you're in the field and you see this sign, you get out of there. Don't worry about your cloak. You just make sure that you get to safety. Verse 17. Jesus said, how dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. And of course, we understand that when you're pregnant, it's a lot harder to travel by foot and get out. And of course, if you've got small children, it's a lot harder to travel by foot and get out. You didn't have a minivan in that day with car seats that you could just throw them in and floor it. And so, woe, literally woe to those who are pregnant and nursing mothers. By the way, just reading through the Greek text of this earlier, it's interesting how different thoughts are expressed idiomatically in different languages. Do you know what the Greek idiom is for being a pregnant woman? It's literally having it in the belly. That's if you were to translate it literally, it's having it in the belly. But anyway. All right. Well, maybe. Yeah, others might not find that funny. All right, verse 18. Pray that this will not take place in the winter. Well, why would you pray that it not take place in the winter? They didn't get a lot of snow in Palestine, but the winter was their rainy season. And so during the rainy season, you understand how, those previously dry stream beds, we think of them as our creeks, how the creeks would be filled up and how, roads could be damaged and it could be impossible to pass different places. So Jesus makes the point that you pray that this won't take place in winter so that you can flee. Because those will be days of distress unequaled from the beginning when God created the world until now, and never will be equaled again. Now, it's been several years since I've read Josephus' description of this, which, by the way, if you're ever interested in reading Josephus, let me recommend to you, rather than reading through the massive volume that contains his works, the Antiquities of the Jews, 20 books of that, and the Jewish-Roman War, you can find that massive volume in most Christian bookstores. It was translated in the 1700s, because Josephus wrote in AD 93 and he wrote in Greek, but in the 1700s, William Whiston translated it into English. And it's a massive volume. It's kind of hard to read now because, again, it's translated in the 1700s. And Josephus is, outside of the Bible, the most important historical source to know what happened among the Jews at this time period. He really is an essential historian. Not everything that he says is true, but for many things, he is our sole source and very well respected. But, he can add a lot of superfluous stuff. So if you ever want to read it, let me recommend that you get a work called The Essential Works of Josephus by Paul Meyer. And Paul Meyer was he's still alive, way up in years. He's a Lutheran, but he's a first-rate historian and taught up at, I think, Western Michigan University. Anyway, it really is good, and he gives you the main stuff and leaves out some of the non-essentials and translates. He's translating straight from the Greek, so it's accurate, but it's in 20th century language. He translated it, I think, in the 1980s, maybe. Todd? Well, the siege was 7 months. Jerusalem fell in, I think, August. But now I would suggest that the point in time when the Christians fled probably in the main would have been before that. And I'll explain why, here in just a minute. But at any rate, okay, here's the reason I started to say this. Sometimes I can get off spewing non-essential things and forget what my main point was. If you read Josephus, and it's been several years now since I've read it. I intended on going back and rereading things in preparation for the class, but I just didn't have a chance. But if you read Josephus, you see that what Jesus says here is not far off. I mean, he's using hyperbole, and we'll notice here in just a few minutes some other places where you find this hyperbolic language, but what Jesus says here is not far off. I mean, the suffering in the city of Jerusalem that these Jews went through was really not even primarily due to the Romans. It was due to their Jewish compatriots, especially the Jewish leaders. And there was just a lot of inhumanity, just a lot of destruction of food supplies. Things got so serious that, I mean, Josephus reports what, in the Old Testament there are these prophecies. You find it beginning in Deuteronomy 28, and then you find it being fulfilled. For instance, Jeremiah speaks of it in Lamentations as he laments over the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians in 586, that mothers would eat their children. And that's how bad things got during the siege in AD 70. I mean, just a very, very horrific circumstance the people found themselves in. But at any rate, let's notice a couple of examples where this hyperbolic language is used. Look at Joel 2. I think I'm remembering. Joel 2. So, it's not altogether clear when Joel wrote. Some have suggested Joel doesn't write concerning a king being in Jerusalem. I mean, Joel is prophesying to the Jews in Judea. He's prophesying to those in Jerusalem. He never makes reference to a king. He makes reference to priests. Some have suggested that he wrote his book during the evil reign of Queen Athaliah. Remember Queen Athaliah, who seized the throne after her son died and tried to kill all of her grandkids so that she could reign as queen. And so some have suggested that Joel wrote during that time. Others have suggested that Joel wrote after the return from Babylonian captivity, when, of course, there was no king that sat on David's throne. It's just not altogether clear when Joel wrote. But here's what is clear. Joel wrote just after a horrific locust plague came upon the Jews in Jerusalem and Judea. And a locust plague, I mean, it was a plague, because locusts, they come in and, we don't see locust plagues, like they do in the Middle East. But, these locusts can be so thick that they just, blot out the sun. And they come in and they eat everything. They eat trees, they eat all vegetation. So it would just absolutely destroy your crops. And it would bring about famine. So a locust plague, if you are an agricultural people, a locust plague, I mean, it can cause much death and much suffering because of the food shortages that are going to result. So a locust plague came against the people. And through Joel, God is prophesying another plague that's going to be even worse. And so Joel is calling the people to repentance. And so in Joel chapter 2, let's start reading in verse 1. Joel says, "Blow the trumpet at Zion." Well, you would blow the trumpet to warn of an approaching army, right? "Sound the alarm on my holy hill. Let all who live in the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. It is close at hand." And, day of the Lord, when we think of the day of the Lord, we think of Jesus' second coming. But in the Old Testament, day of the Lord is any day of God's judgment. A day of darkness and gloom And literally with the locust plague, it would be a day of darkness and gloom because, again, the locusts could just, completely blot out the sun. They could be that thick. A day of clouds and blackness, like dawn spreading across the mountains. You see how picturesque this is as the locusts come. Dawn spreading across the mountains. A large and a mighty army comes, such as was never in ancient times, nor ever will be in ages to come. Such as was not in ancient times, nor ever will be in days to come. Now you just compare that. Look at Exodus chapter, I think it's 10. Am I right? So, as the plagues are being sent upon Egypt, there are 10 of them. They're plagues upon the gods of Egypt, Exodus 12:12. And in chapter 10, we come to the 8th of these plagues, and it's the plague of locusts. And so in Exodus chapter 10, verse 13, we're told this. So Moses stretched out his staff over Egypt, and the Lord made an east wind blow across the land all that day and all that night. By morning, the wind had brought the locusts. They invaded all Egypt and settled down in every area of the country in great numbers. So they're settling down on all the vegetation. Never before had there been such a plague of locusts, nor will there ever be again. You see that language? Used for 2 locust plagues. And so what that should alert us to is, this is not meaning to communicate this literal truth, because that'd be a contradiction. Both of these talking about locust plagues, but it's hyperbole in order just to emphasize how horrific this suffering is. And so, I wouldn't say that the suffering of the Jews when, Jerusalem was besieged by the Romans was worse than the suffering of the Jews when Jerusalem was besieged by the Babylonians. But Jesus is just simply saying this is going to be a time of just horrific suffering. Now go back to Mark chapter 13. And let me make one more comment. We've already made the case that this should not be made to walk on all fours. But still yet notice what's said. Because those will be days of distress unequaled from the beginning when God created the world until now, never to be equaled again. I do want you to think about, however, how unnecessary this statement would be if, as the premillennialists claim, this is the end of the world. Right? I mean, if this is describing tribulation that's going to come during the last 3.5 years before Jesus comes and brings an end to the present situation and ushers in the millennial kingdom, just think about how unnecessary this statement will be. He says, those will be days of distress unequaled from the beginning when God created the world until now and never will be equaled again. Well, duh. Because this is the end. I mean, that statement itself shows that this is not the end of history. This is the end of the Jewish nation as such, of course, until it's revived in 1948, but this is not the end of the world itself. And so that's just another one of these contextual clues that let us know that premillennialists and, prophecy experts that we hear on the radio, they're misreading this text. So we should not think that this is something that, we're just waiting for it to be fulfilled. All right, look at verse 20. If the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, whom He has chosen, He has shortened them. So So he's talking about the days of the abomination of desolation, the days when Jerusalem is sieged. And Jesus said if those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but they're cut short for the sake of the elect, so that the elect can survive. And by elect, what he's talking about is Christians. Now, there's no evidence that you had any Christians in Jerusalem during the 7-month siege. There's just no evidence of that. You very likely had Christians in Jerusalem when Cestius Gallus at first laid siege to Jerusalem in AD 66, but not when Titus did in AD 70. But you remember, as we pointed out, Cestius Gallus, though he led his Roman soldiers to lay siege to Jerusalem, in the war his supply lines were cut off, and he didn't feel like he can continue to feed his armies and supply his armies and continue the siege. And so he pulled back from Jerusalem. And when he pulled back from Jerusalem, that very well was the time when people like, say, John, the Apostle John, fled from Jerusalem. And so that's an example of how the Lord shortened those days for the sake of the elect, so that the elect could escape. So that would be my suggestion there. Any comments or thoughts? Everybody's been kind of quiet.
One of the thoughts I was thinking about how great it was,
Mm-hmm.
like it. Anybody has gone through such a horrific period like that, say when the Spanish flu hit in the early 1900s, that was nothing like it back then. When other things happened, people were huge attack on people, go through Ukraine.
Sure.
There's been nothing like it.
Yeah, that's
I mean, it's so, the point is well taken, you gotta be real careful what we're pointing out here and there, because, we do see that a lot with the group of people. And if we do something wrong, people talk about this, kind of get carried away with it.
sure.
And we forget about it, we need to just remain faithful, we need to focus on what's ahead of us and do what we're doing. Because we can read way too much into what the scriptures are doing, and we're not going to hurt ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, sir. Greg? Mm-hmm. I mean, verse 19 or age 19? Or 2019? People have been on the world from the beginning. So you're wanting us to get off the subject of prophecy and talk about creation science and the age of the earth. I'll just quickly, no, and I'm just giving you a hard time. It's a great question. And you know that I always welcome any questions or any comments, and it's okay to chase a rabbit, and we can always come back to the text. So, there are several views, on creation, and on how Genesis 1 and 2 relate to creation and to the age of the earth and all of that. So, the standard view is that God created the world in 6 24-hour days. And so from that standpoint, if the world were created in 6 24-hour days, as just a straightforward reading of Genesis 1, leads one to the conclusion, then people have been on the earth from the beginning of creation because they've been on the earth from the 6th day. Right? So others doubt that, and I'm not going to talk about unbelievers, and those who just full on accept the evolutionary theory. But there are other Christians who, when they look at science and the scientific data, they come to the conclusion, well, the earth and the universe sure do appear to be old. And, you just go through all the various methods that cause them to reach that conclusion, rings on certain trees and radiometric methods of dating and carbon-14, etc., etc. And so they come to the conclusion, well, the universe must be, as standard science says, 14.5 billion years old, or what is it? No, maybe it's 13.7, and the world must be about 4.5 billion years old, and at some point God must have chosen to create man on the earth, and then they've got to find out some other way to explain Genesis. And so there's lots of different ways that they try to do that. You've got day-age theory, where each day isn't 24 hours, but each day is an epoch of time. And they argue that, sometimes day in the text is used for more than a 24-hour day, like, Genesis 2:4 looks at the whole creation week as the day. And then other people say, well, no, Genesis 1 is a poetic account. It's not intended, they're clues, they would say. It's not intended to be taken as a literal play-by-play of how God created the world, but it's just intended to communicate the theological truth that God did it. And so there's harmony between, what they would understand science to say and what the Bible says. And then there's me. And I'm, my particular view, I'm not altogether impressed with creation science. I don't see creation science convincing a lot of people. A lot of scientific discoveries have been made on some of the standard scientific assumptions that certainly involve the age of the universe and all that sort of stuff. My particular viewpoint is that the world looks old. And legitimate science indicates that the world's old. And we might have every reason to believe that the world was old if we weren't also the recipients of some privileged information. And that privileged information is an account that was written by someone who was there. That is, God through Moses. God was there, Moses wasn't there. And so, to me, you just have a hard time, and I've looked at it different ways. I would adopt the poetic view if I were going to be an old earth creationist. I think that would be the most consistent. But I just still have a hard time reconciling some of these statements with a full-on old earth view. A statement just like this that you pointed out, or Exodus chapter 20 verse 11, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day, wherefore the Lord blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, etc. So what I would say is the world is young, but the world looks old. And the reason the world looks old is because of at least three reasons. Number one, God created the world full grown. If you were to look at Adam and you were to do a bone test on Adam when Adam was 5 seconds old, Adam would appear to be mature. Whatever age that was, he would be mature, capable of reproduction, etc., etc. Now, he's not 30 years old, or whatever the age is. He's not 30 years old. Adam's 5 seconds old. But he looks old. And everything was created full grown. Everything was created fully functioning. You can't argue that because light travels at 186,000, 282, whatever it is, miles per second, that, therefore the universe had to be billions of years old for light to travel, however many light years to the earth. No, everything was in place. The stars were visible whenever God made them on the fourth day. So everything was created with the appearance of age. Number two, the universe went through trauma with the curse. When God said, "Cursed is the ground for your sake," that changed things. I believe in light of statements, Genesis 1, the green vegetation is given to man and to animals. Isaiah chapter 11, would seem to point out that that predation is the result of sin. Whenever God cursed the ground and cursed the universe, that changed things. And you think about what trauma does. Look at a house that burns down. That house may have just been built in the last year, but as the fires consume that house and whatever is emitted, things age, things look older. So there was that, and then in the third place there was the flood that affected the whole face of the earth. And what do you do with all that water? I think you could rightly interpret Psalm 104 that the mountains rose, the valleys sank, places were found to put the water, just the whole face of the earth appeared different. And so those are the things we know about. So I would say that we can trust science, number one. And I would say we would have every reason to believe that the universe were old if it weren't for what the Bible says. And you say, well, does that mean that God lies then? No, because God has told us. God isn't lying. God has told. Well, why on earth then would God allow things to look old, but yet in His Word tell us they're young? What about the crisis of faith that creates for people? Well, that's what God does. Think about 2 Thessalonians 2. For those who didn't love the truth to be saved, for them God sent them a working of error that they should believe a lie. They say, we don't want the truth, we want a lie. God says, here you go, you have a lie. You remember He sent the lying spirit in the mouth of all of Ahab's prophets. The evidence for faith is not so overwhelming that someone can't believe. I think it's sufficient to prove the case, but it still gives someone who doesn't want to believe space to wiggle and to refuse. Okay, hands.
I was going to make a statement similar to what you were saying. But Adam was he was a superhuman. He came pre-programmed. The second he was born, he had to talk and walk and all these things that don't work.
Right.
And it's a mature earth because God made it a mature earth. He made everything mature, so it's the same thing.
Sure. Yes, sir.
Just think from the Bible that God is looking for true believers, and these people want to believe all these things, and that's where the choice comes from.
Right.
I think that's why those things are happening.
Yes, sir. Very true. Anybody else?
So would that make Adam 30 years older when he died?
Well, I would say that 930 years. That yeah, yeah. He looked an extra 30 years. Yeah, sure. There you go. Well, Methuselah was 969, but yeah. There you go. So, anybody else? Right. Yes, ma'am. Oh, I'm sorry. Uh-huh.
You mentioned, radio guys that prophesize and dissect the end of times and stuff.
Right.
On everyone's deathbed, that last 5 minutes you have is the end of times, and each individual's walk with Christ is individual. Now, whether God comes back and judges the world, what is the distraction? What is the distraction? It's important to stay diligent and not be distracted by stuff like that. Media, false prophets, stuff that's not in the Bible. really, when you're laying there and you're taking your last breath, that's the end of times. Time after time in history, great civilizations crumbled at their zenith. You know, and who's to say what does it matter if we're headed for that? What does it matter if you're riding the fence? Who owns the fence? You know, where do you want to be at your end of time?
Sure.
That's the important. You know, don't get distracted with this and that. You know, stay diligent. The path is narrow. You will enter.
Yeah. Hebrews 9:27. It's appointed that a man once to die, and after that the judgment. So, very good comment. We all need to not boast ourselves of tomorrow, because today might be our last day.